Hello and welcome back to another episode of Critical Reactions with your host Bryan. We're going to continue on with this week's theme, exploring melodic bass lines. Today we're going to be looking at a group called Isis off of an album that we have checked out before called Panopticon. Today we're going to be checking out the track Backlit. Let's dive into it and see what Isis is bringing to the table today. Interesting effect put on the bass. It swells and comes back down. There's a volume shifting on it. This is a massive change of pace right here. Very large, lots of compression. A lot of the instruments are blurring together in a wall of sound. We do have that moving bass line. Massive shift up, bass taking the lead here. have some synths in the background, that's new. Introducing some tension harmonically. Yeah, I'm still sort of working within that 3-3-2 structure. Well, they sort of took it in an interesting direction, though. The way that they end this phrase. The drummer has really interesting phrasing for some of these ideas. Yeah, like the second quarter of this chorus right here. It's such a strange idea, and it doesn't help that we shift ideas on beat 7 as well, which just adds to the oddity of all of it. Yeah, so we got some nice post music there. Very atmospheric, very slow burn, very based on emotion more so than melody. I was going to say riffs, but there are riffs in here. They're just, they're not really based around melodic ideas. I want to check something real quick before I get into the conversation. All right. I just wanted to double check that I did the right thing for this, that this wasn't a special selection or something, and that it actually was for our theme, melodic bass lines. I don't mean to throw any shade at the people who suggested it or the patrons who voted for this song. But this to me is not really a song that I would have ever suggested for this. And it could just be a discrepancy of understanding of what melodic means. I suppose that can be a subjective phrase. What is a melodic bass line? To me, it's a bass line that plays melody. A lot of the bass work in here was still chordal. A lot of it was pedal tone with some leading tones between the root notes. We'll play one root note, and then instead of jumping right to the next one, we might play one of the notes between it for a beat before moving to the next, but it's still a series of root tones. It's still more harmonic and foundational than melodic. Even when we get to the bridge of the song, which is when the track brings it down quite a bit and our bass takes lead. I even mentioned this verbally. I think I said, hey, the bass is taking the lead now. It was still like a one bar idea, a very short cyclical loop, very reminiscent of yesterday's Metallica's Orion, which had the bass kind of pushing towards more of a melodic idea throughout most of the track, but really landing on what I assume it was voted for in the bridge, which is also just a very short loop that has melodic qualities to it, but it's still not really a melody to me. And I'm a little concerned that this is how the whole week's going to go, simply because in the wide world of bass, this isn't really great for the theme, but in the world of rock and metal, the bass doing something like this is phenomenal. Nobody would let a bass do this. This must be melodic, that kind of vibe. It's really sad how low the bar is set within this genre. So, there's definitely some fantastic bassists who probably could have done well this week. Les Claypool would have been a really good pick this week. The bassist from, I can't think of the name. It's a tech death band. In fact, most tech death bands would have fit in here. Probably some good prog rock, but honestly, stuff outside of rock would have done really well. Also, anything in the jazz family of stuff, we could have gone funk. We could have even gone like 80s, 70s, and 80s pop music. Tended to have a pretty strong focus on bass ideas. There's a lot of genres where I think bass could have shine through, shown through. And so far, we have two tracks kicking the week off that, at least personally, I don't think are really great for the theme. And it's not even necessarily that I wanted bass dominated songs. I just wanted a bass with a melody line somewhere in the track. And so far, we've been like just on the cusp of that. If the line for is a lick a melody, right? And we have a gauge for it. And I say, like, right here at the 10% mark, you need to have 10% melody for me to call it a melodic line. We're like at 11%. We've just barely crossed the threshold where I'm like, yeah, there is something melodic about this. But especially with this track, I would not necessarily call that a melody. But again, just to wrap this little section up, I do think that it is a vocabulary thing, where my idea of a melody is just different than other people's, and that could be completely based off of my exposure to music, um, and other people's exposure to music, and so we have different barriers for what crafts a melodic bass line. So, with that said, let's get into a discussion of the song proper, devoid of any baggage that the theme might be bringing into the conversation. This is, as I mentioned, a very post track. There is a lot of wall of sound, a lot of compression so that all the instruments sort of mesh together into a singular monolithic audio being slammed into my ears. We hear this a lot during the choruses, and it's juxtaposed with usually these more atmospheric, semi-ambient ideas, layering the guitars and the bass and the drums, sometimes synth. And towards the end, as we saw in the bridge, we get a bit of a slow burn on this as we add ideas on top of each other until we build up back into a really big section to wrap the track up. A little bit of both post-rock and post-metal in here, though I suppose post-metal can also encompass the more ambient, atmospheric stuff. I tend to associate that with post-rock. Um, One thing that I really enjoyed in this is the drumming. It's kind of bizarre. The drummer continues to impress me with ideas. And it's not that the drummer was consistently doing new things. Much like most of the band members, everything in here is crafted of a lick, or in drum terms, usually a pattern, that's on the shorter side. The drummer tended to operate within 2 and 4 bar phrases, and once you've heard it once, you've heard it every time. There was no change happening to the drum pattern. But the thing is that when we did introduce a new drum pattern, maybe for the verse, maybe for the chorus, maybe for one of the 2 bridge sections, every single time the drummer did something, an accent pattern, a rhythmic flow, that was just a little obtuse for what the general rhythmic idea was being presented by the rest of the band. And I found it to be really interesting that the drummer consistently put their own spin on things. For instance, the chorus is still kind of bonkers to me in a lot of ways. Let's just talk about the chorus, right? So, the bass, pedal tone, playing root notes of what the chords are doing, utilizing lead tones to get between pedal notes, um, and the guitars are wall of sound, chords, just really big, loud volume, all that stuff. The vocals are harsh vocaling on top of it. I don't know if I should say growling or screaming. It sort of sits in a middle ground for me, and I'm not quite sure what the technique was. So we're just going to go with harsh vocaling on top of all of this. Very static in pitch, in delivery. There was very little change to it. It was basically just adding another texture onto the entire track. This section was also primarily presented in the... oh no, that was the bridge. The bridge was in the 3-3-2 pattern. So the pattern here was bonkers because you basically have a 6-beat idea of always being on the backbeat on 2, 4, but then we get to 6 and we have one that comes on the and of 5, so just before 6 and then 6 we get this double hit, and this takes us into a new section of the chorus, which means that I counted it out. All right, we are in 4/4. We are operating in 16-beat phrases. It's just that we're not operating in 4 groups of 4. We operate in a 6, and then I'm not quite sure what the next group is. I think it's a 10, because that would bring us to 16, which would make sense. But it never quite feels that long. That would be over 1.5 times our opening 6-beat phrase. It doesn't feel that long. But I think it is. And then we get to beat 16, and we start the idea over again. It is kind of bizarre, because the thing is, too, what makes the 10 so difficult to count out is that I find very little landmarks in there from any of the instruments. The guitars are so fuzzy and distorted that it's really difficult to hear really hard articulation. All the notes sort of blend together with each other. The drums are the only place that we get any real sense of staccato notes, a real sense of a harsh attack on anything. But even the drums have an interesting rhythmic pattern to them that don't fall onto anything standard or even symmetrical. They sort of just accent, usually on the snare, seemingly at random. And so this group of 10 isn't split up into 2 groups of 5 or 2 groups of 4 and a group of 2 or anything like that. It sort of just is 10. There's no way to nicely break it up, which is just a very bizarre is not the right word, unorthodox, we'll go with. It's an unorthodox decision. And of course, having this odd split and this really lengthy section that doesn't have any way to neatly subdivide it is odd because it's asymmetrical. We have a 6 and a 10 rather than an 8 and an 8. It's a wild ride. It really is. I think people who are familiar with ISIS, or maybe who don't feel rhythmic patterns, especially... So here's the thing, right? We all listen to a lot of music. I think that's why most of us are here. We listen to a lot of music. We have a love and a passion for music. At a certain point, I think you begin to pick up on patterns. Maybe that's subconsciously, maybe that's consciously. Either way, it's how we begin to develop a language, and it's what makes things feel odd. If you grew up listening only to avant-garde music, anything with more structure would be a bit obtuse, because it's different than what you grew up on. It's different than the language that you're most comfortable with. When it comes to rhythm, I am very aware of 4 on the floor. I'm very aware of 4-beat bars, 4-bar phrases. These are things that are in a lot of music, and subconsciously, I don't even have to think about it. I will hear something that moves outside of that realm, and I'm like, oh, that's a little odd. Let me investigate. I'm curious if other people felt that same way about the chorus before I brought it up. In particular, if you haven't listened to this track before, as usual with with repetition builds familiarity, and those who have heard the song a lot are going to find that to be a bit more natural of a chorus because it's what they're used to. Again, it's all about that familiarity. So I'm kind of curious about it, but on first time listen, I'm just like, what is going on here? My whole time with that chorus was just so odd every time we came back to it. Now, the bridge, I really wanted to like the bridge. It was one of our first big deviations. We brought the energy back down as if we were returning to a verse, but we had a brand new bass lick to it. And when the guitars came in, they weren't just a homogeneous chordal idea that sat on top of the bass. They came in by layers. The synth came in around here too. There's a lot of ideas that helped change the song up. It just ends up feeling very samey to me. And I think this is a problem I've brought up with a lot of post metal. Sometimes I can get over that hurdle and I buy into it and I feel the emotion because that's what post metal is about. It's about atmosphere and emotion. If you can connect with it, I feel like the length of time that they reside in ideas and the weight that they put into many of their sections, it can be very affecting. I was not affected. And I'm sitting here in the bridge and I'm like, okay, this is kind of neat. We changed some things up, but nothing really changed. The atmosphere, the weight, all of it was very similar. And so the more I thought about this, we have a contrast in this track between the quieter, not quieter, but less dense sections like the verse and the beginning of the bridge versus the large, heavy, weighty sections, pretty much the chorus and the back half of the bridge. And so we have this jump of intensity, lower intensity, higher intensity. Except in in the moment of listening to it, right? Maybe analytically, I recognize there are differences in levels here. There are contrasting elements in this track. But when I'm listening to it, it all feels very samey to me. It doesn't matter what section we're in, it doesn't matter what level of perceived volume there is, it doesn't matter how much layering's going on. All of the atmosphere is very similar, the tones are all similar, the chord progressions are all similar. And so 8 minutes of that kind of just wore me out. Not in a positive way where I felt emotionally exhausted from being exposed to this, just tired of it. Unfortunately, this is just a me problem with post music. Like I said, you really have to buy into what it's doing, and I have a really big issue with that. I just can't do that casually or critically. This is just a genre that it's rather rare for me to emotionally engage with, despite being one of the most emotional subgenres of metal. I think the repetition is just a really big hurdle for me. And so, as much as I wanted to like the bridge, the way that it changed things, brought in new timbres, altered the composition for the first time, of all the changes that happened, it still didn't really feel different to me. And so I was kind of torn here. I was like, oh, okay, this is some really cool stuff. We're taking it in a new direction. And then the other half of me was like, is it really a new direction? No. It's more like we shifted 5 degrees to a different, a different looking direction, but we're still walking generally to the same point. Um, so I don't know, man. I feel like that's just post metal in a nutshell for me, though. Let's hit some lyrics. Alright, so I learned something pretty cool today. The album title is Panopticon, and this song is about a panopticon. I didn't know what one was. I'd heard the word before, I've said it a couple of times. I've even played a pretty cool asymmetric VR game called Panopticon that embodies this whole concept. It makes the name of the game make a lot of sense now. A panopticon is a prison design described by Wikipedia as where a single watchman is able to observe all the inmates without them being able to tell whether or not they are being watched. It doesn't describe what a panopticon would normally be, but I envision a like a perimeter of walls, right? And this would be where all of the prison rooms are. It could be a square, it could be a pentagon, it could be whatever. And in the middle is a watchtower, probably with one-sided tinted windows, so that the person inside can look out at all of the rooms. They have a full 360-degree view of the prison, but no one can look in to see where the warden is watching from. So nobody knows if they're being watched, and it feels like you're constantly under surveillance. The lyrics say, always object, never subject. So the subject of a sentence is the person doing an action, such as Greg throws a ball. Greg is the subject. The ball, what is being affected or acted upon, Greg is throwing the ball. The ball is the object. So in this case, the guards are the subject and they watch the prisoners. They're being acted upon. The prisoners are the objects. Always the object. That power never gets shifted, ever. Always object, never subject. That's a very dehumanizing thing, by the way. It is why objectification is detrimental in, I should say, consistent and expressed objectification is detrimental to mental health. People like to feel like they're in control, and when you are always something that is acted upon, you lose that agency. Yeah, just 4 words explains a lot about what's going on in this song already. It says, can you see us? Are we there? Can you see me? We are watching. I think that's interesting because it leans into the idea of them being objects, always being watched in this panopticon. But at the very end, there's a reversal. We are watching. It says, you are fading in the daylight. Now this is where things take a little bit of a turn. There aren't a lot of lyrics. In fact, we are at the end of the track here, only being 4 stanzas long, but it feels like the perspective has shifted from the prisoners to the guards. It says, always upon you, light never ceases, lost from yourself, life never ceases, thousands of eyes, the gaze never ceases. Light is upon you till life in you ceases. So you can't hide anywhere. I think that's the idea of using light as a metaphor, that the light will always be on you. You'll always be visible to me. There's thousands of eyes. Like I said, you don't ever know if you're being watched, but it feels like you're always being watched. That's the idea of the panopticon. So thousands of eyes, the gaze never ceases. Well, you know what? This doesn't necessarily need to be from the perspective of, okay, so here's where I'm getting, right? This is a prisoner describing the experience. This isn't the warden saying, my light's always going to be on you. The you here is a royal you. It's more of a we. Always upon us, light never ceases. I think that's more of how it's supposed to be read. You lose yourself, again, like I mentioned earlier about constant objectification is a loss of agency. It's bad for mental health. It can also lead to a loss of sense of self. So he says, lost from yourself. thousands of eyes, the gaze never ceases, the light's always upon you until your life ceases. Yeah, it's about the oppressiveness of a panopticon. And you know what? Oppressive's a really good word for this. Much like a lot of post-rock, I feel like this music does a really great job of sonically expressing a weight bearing down on a listener. And I think the heavier sections, particularly the chorus, feels like this weight, especially the contrast of it from the verse. It's this pressure. Now, in the music, that pressure does end, both at the end of the song, but also when we get to the contrasting sections. I wonder if those are supposed to represent anything within this, but the idea of having this constant force presented on you, the idea that you're always being watched and how that can drive you mad, it can stress you out. I think the music does a great job of showcasing that alongside the lyrics. Those are my thoughts. ISIS's Panopticon. ISIS's Backlit by from their Panopticon album. I got this. What are your thoughts about this track? Is there anything you agree with me on? I'm sure some fans are going to find some stuff to disagree with me on. Let me know all of that stuff down in the comment section. You can also give me your general thoughts, opinions, and perspectives about the track. Above that, in the description box, you'll find a link to Linktree, which takes you here to this menu. You can find links to my music, ways to support the channel, a link to the Discord server, and so much more. Above that, if you could, like, subscribe, and ring the bell. I greatly appreciate all three of those. Alright, that wraps it up for this one, but we do have a special selection coming up next. Otherwise, I'll be back tomorrow, 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, 9 p.m. UTC as usual. Until next time, remember to be critical, not cynical, of the music you listen to, and have a fantastic morning, afternoon, or evening, whenever you choose to watch my videos.